Thank you, Mr. Chandu Nair. First of all, I'm sitting in the middle, flanked by two very distinguished, guests. I can call them friends now, Nagappan and Chandu Nair. So I couldn't be feeling more assured and more secure in the August company on my both the sides. Thank you very much, Mr. Mahalingam and Captain Vijay, for giving me this honor, and to all the esteemed members and the guests who have taken the trouble to attend this session today evening. I'm really grateful to all of you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Kicking off, can't be a better way to kick off with a brief snapshot about the book. And so let me first share with you what was the motivation behind writing this book. Why did I embark upon this project and how did this happen? So publishers of this book, the LF Book Company, they are one of the very distinguished publishing house of India, an associate company of Rupa Publishing. And they publish authors like Shashi Tharoor, Ira Makhoti and more. And they've known me for a long time, and they were actually encouraging me that, Rohit, there is a book inside you and you must do this project. And, as an entrepreneur, when you're busy building a business, you feel that it's not a priority. But finally, when they approached me in September of 23, I decided to take the bait that, let me do this and then let me stop procrastinating. And this is the time for it to happen. And the reason, my motivation at that point in time was because of the work that I do. And because of the nature of the work that I do, the kind of people that I meet and the kind of data that I see, increasingly over the years, I'm coming to believe that the next 10 years of India could be India's best years in this entire century. And I'll give you a very simple high school mathematics, which is very easy to understand for everybody in India. We all know that our economy is growing on an average 6 to 7% every year. Some years, maybe 8%, some years, maybe 6%. On an average, 6 to 7%. Then add to that the inflation of our country, which is now on an average, we can say safely about 5%. So in nominal terms, real growth of 6 to 7 plus inflation, about 11 to 12% is what our GDP is growing every year. Now, if you do a simple high school maths and you compound the GDP by, say, 11 to 12% every year, over 10 years, it will become 3x. Right? At this rate at which our country is growing, by the collective hard work of every Indian in this country, our country's GDP will become 3x 10 years down the line. Now, what does that mean? When a country's growth happens, it's an average growth of the classroom, right? Of a classroom. There would be certain businesses which will be above average performers. They will become 4x. There will be some businesses which will be performers. They will become 5x during these 10 years, and there will be some businesses which will be outstanding performers. They could grow 6 to 7 times over a 10-year period. Now, this is a growth phase. So when the growth happens, what happens? It creates jobs and it creates affluence for the society. So I thought that the timing couldn't be better to convey whatever little I've learned in my journey as a wealth entrepreneur for the last 25 years. I've been a student of wealth, working with incredible wealth creators of our country, that what goes into creation of wealth. That I thought there is a book, which should be written and must be written for every Indian, because this is a time for every Indian to think of being a wealth creator. This was reason number one, the mathematical reason. Then there was a reason which had a bit of a chemistry also behind it, and it says that in India, thankfully not now as much, but 20 years back, wealth as a subject used to be a taboo. Anybody who wanted to create wealth was seen that he or she is like a money-minded person. So wealth creation was not seen as a very noble objective, right? And I thought that mindset shift has to happen in our country. If we have to become wealthy, we have to become wealth creators. So the timing is this, where India is going to become whatever business anybody in this room is doing, big and small, doesn't matter. If you are running it well, it has the potential to grow 5, 6, 7 times in next 10 years. That is going to happen just by the market expansion. And if we have a mindset towards growth, towards creation of wealth, we all can become wealth creators in our own respect. So I thought the combination of these two reasons, the mathematical opportunity and the reason that we don't discourage wealth creation, this is the time to write a book for every Indian, which can then share the insight, which I have the privilege of learning because of the work that I do. That was the motivation. And then when the publishers, the first time they sat with me, they asked with me that, Rohit, share the concept of the book. And then I shared the concept of the book. Then they say, okay, now make the structure of the book. So there were 3 parts I kind of thought that the book should be useful to the reader. The first part talks about why wealth. Why wealth is important, because as Indians, as a society, first of all, we need to answer that question. We need to build conviction why wealth is important for each one of us, right? So the first part of the book talks about, why wealth is important for an individual and why wealth is important for individuals, societies and countries all over the world. And I've used some anecdotal evidence, some very simple data from all over the world, which all of us can very easily relate with and understand to drive home the point that why wealth is important for everybody. Then the section 2 talks about, these, I call it the laws of wealth creation. These are some of the principles which I've learned as I mentioned, as a student of wealth, working with some of the best, finest wealth creators of this country, that what goes into creation of wealth. And I put together some of those principles which are, very eminently relatable and also implementable in our lives. If we can bring that into our lives, all of us can be wealth creators. So that the second section talks about what are the laws of wealth creation, right? So that we can become informed wealth creators. And now, the third section, now you've created wealth. Now you have an additional responsibility in life to take care of that wealth. So it then talks about how do you protect and grow that wealth, which is part 3. So those are the laws which I mentioned there, which talks about laws of keeping and growing wealth. Now, because, if you can't keep wealth which you have created, there's no point creating it, right? If you're going to become bankrupt after becoming a billionaire, what's the point of becoming a billionaire? So the third section talks about that, at the end of the day, your wealth, my wealth is also a subset of the national wealth, right? If we fritter away our wealth, we destroy our wealth, any individual, family, business destroys wealth, it's a national loss also. So the third section with that spirit talks about that now you are an owner of a wealth, how you should protect it and continue to compound it. So that is broadly the reason why I wrote this. I embarked upon this project, and that's the broad structure of the book for you. We can kick off from here now.
Okay, one of the things that you talked about is this mindset of wealth creation. Okay, when you define this mindset of wealth creation, what do you find? You've seen so many clients, many of them have created wealth, but on average, a lot of people find it difficult to create that wealth. Why is it? Because of a scarcity mindset? Is it because of circumstances? What exactly creates that mindset of abundance or feeling that, I can create wealth? And probably then I'll move to Mr. Nagappan to talk from his lived experiences as a stockbroker and stock analyst.
No, very good question, Chandu. Thank you for asking this. And so I have a very different and interesting perspective on this. It's obvious, we live in a country which is not an affluent country. I would call it a lower middle income country with a per capita income touching now $2,700. We still have a long way to go. But still, there are brilliant case studies, very, very inspiring case studies in a country where people came from very humble backgrounds and they have become possibly the richest families of our country. I can give the name, I've mentioned the names of these people also, like Mr. Dhirubhai Ambani. He studied only till 8th standard and he used to work at a petrol gas station, not one in India, right? So there are several such a case studies and examples. So many of them are there, in our country, which, by their own sheer desire to grow, they were able to create wealth. So I think it's a mindset. If you've already thought that, I'm poor and I have limited resources, I've got a limited access, I cannot be a wealth creator, sure be it, you will never be a wealth creator. But if you have decided that, irrespective of the circumstances, I am going to be a wealth creator, you will be a wealth creator. So it begins with a thought, it begins with your mind, and everything else, thought leads to an idea, idea leads to an action, action leads to destiny. So I think that seed, whether I am poor, I cannot be a wealth creator, or irrespective, I am poor, I will be a wealth creator, that creates a difference between whether you will be a wealth creator or not.
One of the things you mentioned, Nagappan, is that you are also, one of your mission is to improve financial literacy. And part of this mindset business is this financial literacy. What do you find are the stumbling blocks that most people have, in India particularly, in getting to a place where they understand money and they're really able to do something about creating wealth, therefore?
I think it's all, I'll put it down to two things. One is the mindset. There's a mental block that I can't understand numbers. I think this book is a very good example you could hardly come across a book on personal finance with not, with most of the books have a lot of numbers, confuse you and all. This book is very strong in the, conceptually it is very strong. It talks about that. Of course, it has got numbers, comparison of gold and all. So I think one is there is a mental block, and that mental block comes along with the ecosystem in which you grow. You could have seen there are in certain places, geographical areas, you can see that people are, even when they are in a high school or a college, they are into business and they are into wealth creation. This is one part. The second part is that why do I need to create wealth? There are two reasons. One is for me, myself. The second part, as Mr. Sarin was mentioning, it's for the greater cause. So once your ecosystem, your family teaches you that you need more wealth. See, the first question I ask myself is, why should I create wealth? I have enough wealth for the last so many decades. But myself have enough wealth for the last so many decades. Not because I'm very rich. I have much more than what I need. Simple. So I'm rich by that way. But then, I need to create more wealth if I am a good fellow. If I am a good person. If I am a good person, more money should come to more good people so that it can again plow back into the society. I think people, if they understand these two things and remove that mental block on number crunching, and I think that should change the mindset. That's what I feel personally.
Okay, I'll continue on this topic. One of the things you mentioned, Mr. Sarin, is this distinction between hunger and greed. Hunger gives you kind of purpose. Whereas greed is likely to be destructive, wealth destruction, over a longer period. But how does one know, because this always a fine distinction, for example, between concern and control. Similarly, the very fine distinction between hunger and greed. How does one know that one is no longer hungry but become greedy? How does one, get into that hungry state of mind and stay there?
No, in fact, you also picked up a question on this chapter, and I am asked a lot of questions on this chapter because I think this is one chapter which has intrigued most of the readers. And there are very nice insights in it, which I have learned over the years, and I wanted to share it with the society. So I think contrary to perception that there is a very thin line between hunger and greed, as per my understanding, there is a very fine line between hunger and greed. And I'll tell you where the difference lies. See, hunger is a mindset where you're focused and driven, passionate, whatever words you want to say, about input, about your karma, what you're supposed to do. For example, I've given, I think, an anecdotal evidence of a case of a doctor, who's very passionate about healing, right? And greed is something which is, somebody who's passionate and driven about the output, right? So also the same doctor, then he's very passionate and driven by that, how much his revenue is growing. He's more focused how much billing he has done rather than how many people he's healed. Right? Now, in the short term, person who may be greedy will definitely the graph may grow faster than somebody who's hungry. But over a period of time, somebody who's hungry, who's actually eventually driven by a larger purpose, is able to build trust with the society and the ecosystem around, then the graph actually takes over. And the character of greed actually then gets identified and the trust breaks down and that person starts falling down. So I think there always will be a fine line, not a thin line between hunger and greed. So if you stay focused on your purpose, you will always stay focused on what you're supposed to do. Even if you're running a business which is for profit, at the end of the day, every business, is solving some problem for the society, for which the society is willing to pay you. As simple as that, is a transportation services, right? Getting from point A to point B in a city, and we take either public transport or using our transport, and we are ready to pay those businesses for solving that problem for us. So if a business is focused on continuing to solve that problem for more and more consumers on the planet, it will scale. And in the process of scaling and solving problem for millions of people, it will end up creating wealth. But if the business is only focused on maximizing their quarter-on-quarter profit so that the stock price continues to grow, then they will start doing stuff, which will end up compromising for the purpose they are in business, and eventually it will catch up with them. So I think there's a very, very fine line between hunger and greed, and eventually I've seen that entrepreneurs and wealth creators, whether they were inheritors or first generation wealth creators, I've seen that they were very much focused on continuing to solve the problem for the society, because that used to give them a kick. And then how can I solve this problem not for 10 people but 10 million people? That is how they used to convert a small business into an institution and leading to wealth creation.
It's fine when you talk of a business person, but a lot of people here are employees. They are in jobs, okay, where they get only a fixed income. And also then they have an issue of time. People today talk of 70 hour, 90 hour, etc. You wonder when you get time even to go to the bathroom. Okay, forget about creating wealth. Okay, so in such a situation, what does that employee do? How does that employee break out of this trap of trying to create something where he or she can create wealth?
Very good question. And in fact, I would like to say, and I've mentioned anecdotes in the book also, and I'll also share one or two of them here with everybody, that the basic concept, whether you're running a business and adding value to the society, or you're working within a business as an employee and adding value to the business, is the same. At the end of the day, you're solving some problem, either as a business owner or an entrepreneur or as an employee of that business or that enterprise. You're solving some problem because of which the stakeholders are willing to pay you. Like if you're an employee, you're working for an organization, you're helping the organization grow. You're solving the problem for the shareholders, for the management, and the management is willing to pay you for it. Not only pay you for it, but also continue to expand your role. And I've given examples of that, how people have grown in their careers. Many a times, people like in my organization, outside, in friends and family, they'll come and seek, career advice. And my simple thing to them is that the simplest way to having the finest career is continue to build trust with your stakeholders. Deliver value for them. If you are not just, not just even delivering value what you are expected to, but exceeding on that, won't any employee in any organization become invaluable for that organization? Why will that organization let that employee go? Rather, that employee will get greater responsibility. And as your responsibilities grow, your compensation grows. That's how you end up creating wealth within the organization. And the best example which I can share is, the current Tata Group chairman. He's an example. He comes without any pedigree from the family. He comes from a simple background, went to a school village, comes from a humble background, and he's the only person in entire history of the Tata Group, non-member from the family to helm the group. And why it has happened? Because over 4 decades of his journey with the group, he earned the trust with the stakeholders, and his job continued to, he became the TCS chairman, and eventually when the situation came, there was nobody else, with the group, the stakeholders sitting at the top of the pyramid of that group could think of other than him, than Mr. Chandra. And he's a brilliant case study. He came from the humblest of the backgrounds like most of us Indians. He was not at all born with a silver spoon, but he's earned it as an employee, and he's a fabulous wealth creator of this country.
Nagappan, I want to ask you the question in a little more philosophical and also in a twisted way. A lot of people today think, that there are shortcuts to financial success. Okay, you've seen it. Usually the movie ends badly. But on the other side, they see certain kinds of people, netas, babus, whatever, amassing huge, disproportionate amounts of wealth in a very short span of time. How does one tell a youngster or anybody else, look, buddy, this is go by the straight and narrow path. This is how you build a career. This is how you can build wealth. Why should you take these kind of shortcuts? How does one bring that value system or that, discipline and not get them tempted into some other way?
Yeah, it's like a utopian thought, but very difficult, I can tell you that. But I think things are, we are changing a lot, and I think that it all comes from, the earlier question, hunger and greed. It's easy to satiate somebody else's hunger also, but it's very difficult to satiate my greed. The greed comes in when I start not living for myself, but when I start living for others. And for that, I have to earn a lot. I have to, all the show off, everything comes in. And that's where you're talking about Babus. But why Babus? Even the top CEOs, if you look at the study which is published today, the last employee, to get the salary of the CEO, I think it takes 500 years. That's a study which says, in a big corporates, the top 200, Nifty top 200 companies, they have studied 110 companies, and they say that the median salary of somebody, for him to reach the salary of the CEO, it will take another 500 years with the thing. So That's the kind of the wealth creation which is happening at top level and outside the system. This is within the system, that outside the system is what you're talking about. So it's a big challenge when we go and talk about all these things. I think the family system, the ecosystem is also indirectly has to be corrected a lot. Unless otherwise that happens, it's very difficult. You see a set of people flashy and spending a lot of money and earning, sitting on huge cash. And the other side, we are talking ethics and other things to people who are at a lower level in a company or something. It's going to be a very tough challenge, I feel. I don't think there is any ready-made answer. It comes within, it comes from the family than the society. Yeah.
Okay, I'll come back to you both again. One of the things, I worked in a company called Asian Paints. Factoid is that it was the highest compounding stock in the history of the stock market. So unfortunately, I didn't invest in that stock at that time. I would have probably made more money in the stock than working for the company. But that aside, one of the things that struck me when I worked in Surat in Gujarat is that many of these people have got multiple ways of making money. I find the mercantile communities, he also belongs to one, have figured out a system. Mm-hmm. Even Kiyosaki talks about it in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that how do you create a system to make money? So most of us are like plumbers, carpenters, even doctors who go every day and have to make money. If we don't go that day, we don't get that money. Okay? But how to create that system? What is it that changes the dynamic, Can you get into a little bit of the plumbing, the how-to of these things,
Yeah, so why don't we, pick up the example that you've given, somebody who's doing plumbing, right? And let us say a daily wage, these are the people who look for daily assignments and their kitchen runs on the basis of their daily earnings.
Housekeeping announcement, may I request everybody to keep this little device on silent, at least, okay, thank you.
Yeah, so going back to the example of, let us say, an electrician or a plumber, and these people, they are not daily wage workers, but they are daily wage earners. So on a daily basis, whatever they earn and their kitchen runs on that basis. But I would say that that's the start of the journey. The system which runs is that eventually wealth creation is a function of your ability to add value at scale, right? So if you are only providing service as an individual by yourself, then you are kind of limited, you've kind of saturated your scalability. So then, even in that segment, we have seen examples. I've seen it, you have seen it, that people become contractors. Contractors of today were erstwhile when they started the career, they were electricians themselves, they were doing the plumbing job themselves. But, over a period of time, they were smarter and they had the hunger to grow. And they put together a team. They grew beyond themselves. They bought another plumber. They got a civil guy, an electrical guy, and they started taking contracts. And by adding more resources, around themselves, what they did, they actually enhanced their ability to add value to more and more customers. So that led to the growth in the size of the volume of the business that they're handling, right? And because of that, they were able to increase the earning. Then what that individual was earning solo as a one skill guy, and here he's earning collectively as a team head, right? So I've seen many such organic examples. I'm sure everybody in the room has also seen many such examples, because there is no dearth of work, in our country. As our economy is growing, there are more and more services. The demand for services is actually growing. The market size is growing. We as service providers, we need to have a vision for that and align our hunger to meet that increasing growing market demand and increase our ability and resources to scale the amount of value addition which you are making. So I think any business, whether it's an Asian Paint or it's a solo who can then form a team, is able to scale, will be able to enhance their own earnings, at their own level. So even for a plumber who's earning, say, 25,000 rupees a month, if he's able to grow 4x 1 lakh, it's a massive jump for them. For them, at that segment, it's a wealth creation.
I want to ask you the same question and also bring in the approach of certain mercantile communities of which you are a part also, and bring that flavor also into this discussion.
See, if you look at, we interact with some self-help groups, women self-help group, and we also teach them about the financial discipline and all. Now, in a small village near Kadalur, there is a self-help group, and nearby town there is a bank. The bank goes and tells them that we will lend you money, let's say 50,000 rupees each, 20 people. And only 8 or 10 of them need money, the rest don't need money. So the bank itself tells them that don't worry, you invest this in our mutual fund. And what is the return will you give? They say we'll give you 1% per month. And I know, I'm sure only many of you have invested, know which mutual fund I'm talking about. They used to give 1% per month, 12% per annum. That the moment market started coming down, the NAV will start coming down. And this is not the way. So we go and tell them, plug the leakages. Don't do this kind of things, and where you lose your money, where you don't, so this is one thing at lower level, at a entry, the people at the BPL families are taken for a ride like this by big banks. So there we have to educate them. There is a lot of financial literacy to be done. This is one thing. Now, where I come from is, like you rightly said, I was mentioning about the same ecosystem where I come from. So, when we were brought up at a very young age itself, I remember what my father used to tell me, that a very popular saying, we all know that a penny saved is a penny earned. But he'll say that's wrong. He'll say a penny saved is a penny earned plus the interest on it year after year. So that's the difference. We are, the moment we spend that 1 rupee, we are not only spending that 1 rupee, we are also spending the return on it future. So this is one thing which I think which is in our again and again. And second thing is that your financial literacy is as important as your school education or college education. There is not even once that my father will call and tell me that go and deposit this dividend warrant to the bank and come back. So I have to fill up the challan when I was about 12 or 13 year old and go to the bank and come back. And I cannot say that tomorrow I have an exam. That's separate. This is also separate. So these are smaller things which we don't, most of the typical middle class, you're talking about the salaried employees, you see that most of them fill up even the college application for their children, they fill up the application because they fear that the student may fill it up wrongly. So I think we have to make them responsible, and if they fail, it's a failure. They will come up. At the young age, they cannot, So there are a lot of learnings which we have learnt.
I think I'll just get into one aspect. Both of you can probably chip in. One of the things that I've seen, and having experienced it personally, is that barring the mercantile communities to some extent, most Indians, again, probably almost everyone here can agree or disagree, they're not logical about money, they're more emotional about money. So even discussions within the family on money are not pleasant. They are not amicable. They are not logical. They are not rational. Yes or no? Okay. So very, very vague and it leads to always some kind of problems. Now, how do you tackle this? How do you, in order for things to really grow, I found that one has to stop being emotional and start being lots more rational and logical. How does one get the family aligned overall? Because without that, how much ever you try individually, nothing is going to happen. How do you get that? And I'll come to you.
Yeah. No, this is such an important topic, which, I'm so thankful that you asked this, because this is important for every Indian, not only everybody in this room, I would say every Indian. And because I've seen this, what Chandu just mentioned out of my profession, that, this topic of financial literacy is one thing which Nagaparnas does. That itself is a challenge. The topic of financial discussion never comes up in the family. If we are dealing with our clients, it's only maybe one member of the family who's dealing with that. The spouse is not interested, first of all. And then this gentleman is also not interested to pull, which is not a right thing, because tomorrow if something happens to this gentleman, then what about the continuity of knowledge about the legacy of the family? Right? So to everybody, at least to begin with in this room, my advice and suggestion would be that, start involving your life partner, to begin with, if nobody else in your family, about the awareness of whatever you have, small or big, doesn't matter. But that awareness has to be there so that, your family, the continuity of financial management is not challenged. Secondly, even children. I would suggest that, when your children, when they've come to a certain age, when they've completed their education, they've started their career, involve them. Make them aware that what all is there, because tomorrow they are the next generation of the family. And you have to, and the legacy of the family, big and small, again, doesn't matter. It's a responsibility for the next generation to take over the baton and carry on. How can you expect them to do that without involving them? So there's a bit of a succession planning has to happen there also. We talk of succession planning in businesses, right? Business continuity and all, you would have heard of, Chandu and Nagappan. We talk about it. What about, continuity in the family? So this is something culturally we have to address. And I see, many families have started opening up and talking about it, which is a good trend, but a lot more has to happen.
Nagappan, I'm going to ask the same question, but with a twist again. It's great. He's talking about a nuclear family, papa, mama, 2 kids, etc. You know how your community has families with extended branches. The discussion becomes even more challenging. And if one guy gets married, then the discussion becomes even about how many bags of rice go to which house and why. Okay, it goes even into that direction. How does one tackle it over there also? In a larger family, extended, multiple arms. What does one do to make the discussion sane and practical?
I think the problem becomes much simpler in huge, large families because the mindset is they listen to the leader, they listen to the person. In the smaller families, 3 or 4 of us, nuclear families, it becomes extremely difficult. That's what I feel. I feel a little different about it. But then, as I said, again, the way we were brought up, the wealth is never shown off until you go to the college. You will be treated like as though you're from a low middle class family. That's how you're brought up. You don't know how much of wealth you possess. Suddenly you realize when you finish your degree that you have so much of wealth and why my father brought me up like this. So, but by the time you're used to a simple lifestyle, the moment you get used to simple lifestyle, in fact, Sarin has mentioned in his book, I think, the difference between wants and needs. So the wants are, we are justifying all wants are our basic needs. That's a problem today. The father, the mother, there is a competition between the children, the society, neighborhood, that all the wants are becoming needs and essential. And that's why we live more for others and that becomes very expensive. The moment we live for ourselves, like Mark Zuckerberg, we need only 4 t-shirts and a jeans. That's all. We don't need much more than